Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door, just like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel. A very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with panelled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on the other. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these, wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden, and meadows beyond, sloping down the river. The hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses have lived in the neighbourhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without bothering to ask him. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbours' respect, but he gained, well, you will have to see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them except the ordinary everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large stupid folks like you and me come blustering along, making a noise like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They're inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colours, chiefly green and yellow. They wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick, warm brown hair, like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. They have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and they laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now, you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the Old Took, head of the hobbits, who lived across the water, a small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up. But the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his make-up from the Took side. Something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived. Until Bilbo Baggins had grown up to being about 50 years old or so, and living in a beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I've just described to you, until he had in fact apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance one morning long ago, in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast smoking an enormous wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, that were neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf! If you had heard only a quarter of what I've heard about him, and I've only heard a very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place, wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his old friend, the old Took, had died. In fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water, on business of his own, since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or mean that it's a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that it's a morning to be good?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine." "There's no hurry, we have all day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful grey ring of smoke that sailed up in the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I've no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure that I'm arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so, in these parts. We are plain, quiet folks, and I've no use for adventures, nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces, blew out another even bigger smoke ring, and then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort, and he wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit, without saying anything, until Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill, or across the water." By this he meant the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you do use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean that you want to get rid of me? And that it won't be any good until I move off?" Not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir. And I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good morning by Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door." Gandalf! Good gracious me! not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone until ordered, not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants, and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons, not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid! They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe, also that he was very fond of flowers. Dear me, he went on, not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures, anything from climbing trees to visiting elves, or sailing in ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quieter here. I mean, you used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea that you were still in business. What else should I be, said the wizard. All the same, I'm pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate, and that's not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I'll give you what you asked for. I beg your pardon? I haven't asked for anything. Yes, you have, twice now. My pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I would go so far as to send you to this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too, very likely, if you ever get over it. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. But please come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. And with that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door and shut it as quickly as he dared. Not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. What on earth did I ask him for tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long and quietly. After a while he stepped up and with the spike of his staff scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he'd escaped adventures very well. The next day he'd almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this. Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he'd been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered it. He rushed and put on the kettle and put on another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two, and he ran to the door. "Oh, I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf, with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he'd been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and, "Dwalan, at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. And when the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? What would you do? They'd not been at table long. In fact, they'd hardly reached the third cake when there came another, even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So, you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf when he opened the door. Instead, there was a very odd-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he'd been invited. "Oh, I see the others have begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwaylen's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it and said, "Balin, at your service." And he said that with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly when he heard those words. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then that he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin, with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any." "Lots!" Bilbo found himself answering to his surprise, and he found himself scuttling off too to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he'd baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwaylen were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. "Oh, Gandalf for certain this time," he thought, as he puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Keely, at your service," said one, and "Feely," said the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwaylen and Balin here already, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He'd only just had a sip in the corner while the 4 dwarves sat around the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and didn't want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong-ling-dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say." "By the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened or what was going to happen and whether they would all stay for supper. Then the bell rang, and louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowen were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, one wanted coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept pretty busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, and altogether bewildered and bewuthered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he could ever remember. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarves, 4 more. And there was Gandalf, behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He'd made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He'd also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he'd put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat." And then open the door like a pop gun. "Let me introduce Byfor, Beaufort, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Byfor, Beaufort, and Bombur, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last one belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Byfor, Beaufort, Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was increasingly fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and he stopped frowning. "Now we're all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods. The best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging there on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there's something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Byfor. "And mince pies and cheese," said Beaufort. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called out the other dwarves through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." He seems to know as much about the inside of my larder as I do myself, thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he'd got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confiscate and bother these dwarves," he said out loud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Dwalin, Balin at the door of the kitchen, and Feely and Keely behind them, and before he could say knife, they'd whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite had quite gone away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you'll all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin. "And after, we shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important and he stayed talking to Gandalf, they jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright, "Please, please be careful, and please don't trouble. I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry door. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you're finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. And that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully, carefully with the plates. And it sounds like the adventure might be underway. Going to leave that bit of reading for today, just there. We're halfway through the chapter of the Hobbit that's called An Unexpected Party.